The $10 gift card to Target felt heavy in my trembling hands as I watched my brother Marcus receive the keys to a fully furnished downtown apartment, complete with stainless steel appliances, hardwood floors, and a view of the city skyline that most people could only dream of affording. It was my 21st birthday, the same day we were supposedly celebrating together since Marcus had turned 23 just 2 days earlier. But the contrast between our gifts was so starkly brutal that even the birthday cake seemed to mock me with its cheerful pastel frosting. "Elena will understand," my mother, Margaret, said, with the dismissive wave that had punctuated my entire childhood, not bothering to look at me as she handed Marcus the second set of keys and the parking garage remote. "She's always been more practical, more independent. A gift card gives her options. $10 worth of options at a discount retailer, while my brother, who had never held a job longer than 3 weeks, who had failed out of 2 different colleges, who still brought his laundry home for our mother to wash, was being handed a $200,000 apartment in the heart of the city's most desirable neighborhood. My father, Robert, clapped Marcus on the shoulder with the pride reserved for sons who had somehow achieved greatness by simply existing. "This will give you the independence you need to focus on your entrepreneurial ventures," he said, as if Marcus's series of failed get-rich-quick schemes qualified as business ventures, rather than expensive hobbies funded by parental indulgence. I stood in the marble foyer of our family home, surrounded by relatives who had gathered to witness what they believed was a celebration of both children reaching adulthood, and felt the familiar sensation of being invisible while occupying the same physical space as people who shared my DNA but had never bothered to understand my dreams, my struggles, or my worth as a human being. "Thank you," I said quietly, forcing my voice to remain steady as I slipped the gift card into my purse. "This is very generous." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but it was easier than acknowledging the truth, that after 21 years of being the responsible daughter, the one who had never asked for anything, who had worked part-time jobs throughout high school to buy my own car and pay for my own college expenses, I was still considered worth exactly $10 of my parents' consideration. Marcus, meanwhile, was already planning which friends he would invite to his housewarming party, discussing the apartment's proximity to the best restaurants and nightlife with our cousins, who congratulated him on his incredible luck in having such generous parents. Elena worked her way through nursing school, our Aunt Susan mentioned, perhaps trying to include me in the celebration. "That's quite an accomplishment." "Oh yes," Margaret replied, with the tone she used when discussing something mildly interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. "Elena has always been very focused on practical matters. Nursing is such a stable career choice." Stable, practical, the words that had defined me throughout my childhood, code language for boring and unworthy of genuine investment. While Marcus was encouraged to dream big and pursue his passions, no matter how unrealistic or expensive those passions might be, I was praised for being sensible enough to choose a career that would allow me to support myself without requiring parental assistance. The party continued for another 2 hours, with Marcus showing off photos of his new apartment to everyone who would look, while I sat in the corner reviewing my own financial situation and trying to calculate whether I could afford to move out of my parents' house sooner than I had originally planned. I had been living at home during nursing school to save money, contributing $500 per month for rent and groceries, while maintaining a 3.8 GPA and working 20 hours a week at a local clinic. My plan had been to stay for 6 more months, while I saved for a security deposit and established myself in my new job at the regional medical center. But sitting in that room, watching my parents celebrate giving my brother everything while giving me nothing, I realized that I couldn't spend another day in a house where my value was measured in discount gift cards, while my brother's potential was measured in real estate investments. That night, after the last relative had gone home and Marcus had left to spend the night at his new apartment, I packed my belongings into the same 2 suitcases I had used for college. I left a note on the kitchen counter explaining that I was moving out immediately, and that they could reach me through my cell phone if they needed anything. I drove to a budget motel near the hospital where I would start work on Monday, paid for a week's stay with money from my savings account, and fell asleep on scratchy sheets while making plans for the independent life I should have started years earlier. But at 2:17 a.m., my phone rang with a call that would change everything I thought I understood about my family, my inheritance, and my own worth in my parents' eyes. "Elena!" My father's voice was sharp with panic and anger. "I need you to bring me the keys to Marcus's apartment immediately." "What keys?" I asked, still groggy from sleep. "I don't have keys to Marcus's apartment." "Don't lie to me," Robert snapped. "The deed is in your name. The lawyer made a mistake, but you're the one listed as the legal owner. I need you to sign the transfer papers and give me the keys so we can fix this situation." I sat up in the motel bed, suddenly wide awake as my father's words sunk in. The deed was in my name. The apartment my parents had given to Marcus, the $200,000 gift that had represented everything I would never receive, was legally mine. "I'll call you back," I said quietly, hanging up on my father's sputtering protests. For the first time in 21 years, I held something my parents wanted more than they wanted to ignore me, and I had no intention of giving it up without understanding exactly why the universe had just handed me the power to change everything. Growing up as Robert and Margaret Chen's daughter meant learning to be grateful for crumbs while watching Marcus feast at a banquet table set exclusively for his pleasure. From my earliest memories, I understood that love in our household was a finite resource, and my brother had claimed the majority of it before I was old enough to compete. The pattern established itself early and never wavered. When Marcus took his first steps at 11 months, my parents threw a party and invited the neighbors to witness this miraculous achievement. When I walked at 10 months, the milestone was noted in my baby book, with a brief sentence and no accompanying celebration. Marcus's first word was "mama," which Margaret declared evidence of his superior intelligence and emotional development. My first word was "more," which she dismissed as simple greed rather than intellectual curiosity. School brought more of the same systematic favoritism, disguised as individualized parenting. Marcus struggled with reading, so my parents hired private tutors, enrolled him in specialized programs, and spent thousands of dollars on learning assessments and educational support. When his grades improved from failing to barely passing, they celebrated with dinner at his favorite restaurant and praised his incredible progress. I taught myself to read before kindergarten and consistently earned straight A's throughout elementary school, achievements that were acknowledged with brief nods and expectations that I would continue performing at high levels without requiring any additional investment or support. "Elena is naturally academic," Margaret would explain to teachers and relatives who commented on the disparity in attention. "She doesn't need as much help as Marcus. Some children are just more self-sufficient." Self-sufficient became the code word for not worth investing in. While Marcus received piano lessons, soccer coaching, art classes, and summer camps designed to develop his potential, I was expected to find my own activities and pay for them with money earned from babysitting neighborhood children. The financial inequity was staggering but never acknowledged directly. Marcus's bedroom was professionally decorated and updated regularly to reflect his changing interests. Mine remained unchanged from childhood, decorated with Disney princess themes that I had outgrown by age 8, but that my parents saw no reason to replace. When Marcus wanted a car for his 16th birthday, Robert and Margaret surprised him with a brand new Honda Civic, complete with insurance coverage and a credit card for gas and maintenance. For my 16th birthday, I received a card with $50 and permission to get a part-time job so I could save money for my own transportation. "Marcus needs reliable transportation for his social development," Margaret explained when I questioned the obvious favoritism. "You're more mature for your age. Working and saving for a car will teach you valuable life skills." Valuable life skills. While Marcus was being chauffeured to parties and social events, I was working 20 hours a week at a local diner, saving every dollar toward a used car that I eventually purchased from a coworker for $3,000. The pride I felt in achieving that independence was tainted by the understanding that it had been necessary because my parents had chosen not to provide for me the way they provided for my brother. The pattern continued through high school and into college planning. Marcus's mediocre grades and complete lack of direction were treated as evidence that he needed time to find himself, preferably at an expensive private college where small class sizes and individualized attention might help him discover his passion. "Marcus is a late bloomer," Robert would say whenever relatives asked about his plans. "Some of the most successful people were underachievers in high school. He just needs the right environment to flourish." My excellent grades, leadership positions, and clear career goals were treated as confirmation that I would be fine anywhere, preferably somewhere that wouldn't strain the family budget after the substantial investment they were making in Marcus's potential. "Elena has always been practical and focused," Margaret would explain. "She'll do well at the state university, and the nursing program there has an excellent reputation. It's perfect for someone with her sensible approach to life." Sensible, practical, focused. All code words for requires minimal investment and will generate steady returns without ongoing parental support. I worked full-time during summers and part-time during the school year to pay for college expenses that Marcus never had to consider. While he enjoyed fraternity parties and expensive spring break trips funded by our parents, I studied in the library and picked up extra shifts at the campus clinic to cover textbooks and living expenses. But perhaps the most painful aspect of our family dynamic wasn't the financial favoritism, it was the emotional investment disparity. Marcus's problems were family crises that required immediate attention and group problem-solving sessions. My problems were character-building opportunities that I was expected to handle independently. When Marcus got arrested for underage drinking his sophomore year, our parents hired an attorney, attended court with him, and spent weeks discussing strategies for minimizing the impact on his future opportunities. When I was hospitalized with appendicitis during finals week my junior year, Margaret sent flowers to my dorm room and suggested I speak with my professors about incomplete grades rather than medical withdrawals. The most devastating example came during my senior year, when I was accepted to a competitive graduate program in nurse practitioning that would have fast-tracked my career, but required a year of unpaid clinical rotations. The acceptance letter represented 4 years of straight A's, leadership experience, and recommendation letters from professors who considered me one of their most promising students. "That's wonderful, dear," Margaret said when I showed her the acceptance letter. "But you understand we can't help with living expenses during unpaid rotations. Marcus is still figuring out his career path, and we need to keep our resources available for his needs." Marcus's needs. At 22, he had changed majors 4 times, failed multiple classes, and was currently exploring becoming a social media influencer while living in our parents' basement and contributing nothing to household expenses. I declined the graduate program and took a position at the regional medical center that would allow me to work while pursuing my advanced degree part-time. It would take longer and be more difficult, but it was the only option available to someone whose parents had already allocated their financial and emotional resources to their more promising child. That had been the pattern for 21 years. Marcus received investment, support, and unconditional love, while I received praise for my independence and reminders that strong people don't need help to succeed, until the night when everything changed, and I discovered that my grandmother had been watching our family dynamics more closely than anyone realized. The motel room at the Economy Inn was everything my childhood bedroom had never been. Mine. The faded floral wallpaper and worn carpet might not have been aesthetically pleasing, but every square foot belonged to me alone, free from the subtle reminders of my lesser status in my parents' hierarchy of children. I had paid for 7 nights with money from my savings account, money I had earned through years of working, while Marcus enjoyed the luxury of parental financial support. Now, sitting on the narrow bed with my laptop open, I was researching apartments I could afford on my new nursing salary while trying to process my father's panicked phone call about apartment keys and legal ownership. The conversation kept replaying in my mind. Robert had been genuinely frantic, his usual composed demeanor cracking as he demanded I return keys I didn't possess to property that apparently belonged to me legally, even though my parents had given it to Marcus as a gift. Nothing about the situation made sense, but one thing was clear. For the first time in my life, I possessed something my parents desperately wanted, and they couldn't simply take it from me. My phone buzzed with text messages that had been arriving steadily since I'd hung up on my father. Robert. Elena, stop being dramatic. Come home so we can discuss this situation like adults. Margaret. Your father is very upset. This legal confusion isn't your fault, but you need to help us resolve it quickly. Marcus, what the hell is wrong with you? Dad says you're trying to steal my apartment? I deleted the messages without responding and continued my research into rental properties, but my concentration was broken by a knock at the motel room door. Through the peephole, I could see Robert standing in the parking lot, his expensive suit looking out of place against the backdrop of budget accommodations and flickering neon signs. Elena, open the door, he called. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. As if my sudden legal ownership of a $200,000 apartment was simply a clerical error that could be resolved through a brief conversation and my immediate compliance with his wishes. I opened the door but didn't invite him inside. What do you want, Dad? I want you to stop this nonsense and come home, Robert replied, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when he expected immediate obedience. The lawyer made an error in the property transfer. The apartment was always intended for Marcus, and you know that. Actually, I don't know that, I said calmly. I know that you and Mom gave Marcus keys to an apartment at a birthday party. But I don't know anything about the legal ownership or why my name is on the deed. Robert's jaw tightened with frustration. Elena, don't be difficult. You understand the situation perfectly well. This apartment is Marcus's graduation gift, and some paperwork error doesn't change our intentions. Marcus graduated? I asked, genuinely surprised. From which college? Because last I heard, he was taking a break from his 4th different major to explore social media careers. He's completing his degree this semester, Robert said stiffly. The apartment is an incentive for him to finish strong and transition into independent adult life. Independent adult life. Marcus, who had never paid a bill, never held a job for more than a few weeks, never faced a consequence for his choices because our parents rushed in to solve every problem before it affected him meaningfully. That's interesting, I replied, because I've been living independently for years, working my way through nursing school, and I never received any incentives or graduation gifts. But somehow, on my birthday, I discover that I legally own property worth more than I'll earn in 4 years of nursing. This isn't about fairness, Elena. This is about fixing a legal mistake that's causing unnecessary drama. No, Dad. This is about me finally understanding that everything I thought I knew about our family might be wrong. And until I figure out why my name is on that deed, I'm not signing anything or giving anyone any keys. Robert's face flushed with anger. You're being vindictive because you didn't get the birthday gift you wanted. This is childish behavior, Elena. I'm being careful because for 21 years, you've taught me that I can't depend on you for anything except disappointment. So when something unexpectedly works in my favor, I'm going to make sure I understand what's really happening before I give it away. I closed the motel room door and locked it, leaving my father standing in the parking lot. Through the window, I watched him pace back and forth while talking angrily on his phone, probably reporting to Margaret that their obedient, practical daughter had suddenly developed a rebellious streak. But this wasn't rebellion, it was self-preservation. Something had shifted in the family power dynamic, and I needed to understand what that meant before I made any decisions about keys or transfers or legal documents. Over the next 3 days, I established a routine that felt more authentic than anything I had experienced living under my parents' roof. I woke up early, worked my shifts at the medical center, and spent my evenings researching apartment rentals and property law. I ate meals at the diner across the street from the motel, where the waitress called me honey and asked about my day with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Most importantly, I made an appointment with a lawyer, not the family attorney who had apparently made the mistake that put the apartment in my name, but an independent legal advocate who could help me understand my rights and options. Sarah Martinez practiced family and property law from a small office near the courthouse, and her initial consultation fee was reasonable enough for someone living on a new graduate's salary. When I explained my situation, she listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that legal ownership wasn't usually accidental. Property deeds don't end up in the wrong person's name by mistake, Sarah told me after reviewing the documents I had requested from the county recorder's office. Someone specifically designated you as the owner of this apartment. The question is who and why. She agreed to research the property's ownership history and the legal mechanisms that had resulted in my name appearing on the deed. In the meantime, she advised me to avoid signing any documents or transferring any property rights until we understood the full situation. Your parents' urgency to resolve this situation suggests they know more about the legal ownership than they're telling you, Sarah observed. People who are certain they have legal standing don't usually panic when faced with bureaucratic errors. As I left Sarah's office, I realized that for the first time in my life, I had legal representation, property rights, and the financial means to fight for what belonged to me. The overlooked daughter was about to discover exactly what she had inherited and why her parents were so desperate to take it away from her. Sarah Martinez called me on a Thursday afternoon with information that would reshape my understanding of my family history and my place within it. I was at work, reviewing patient charts in the break room at the medical center, when her voice carried the careful tone lawyers use when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. Elena, I need you to sit down for this conversation, she said. The property research revealed some information about your family that you might not have been aware of. I set down my coffee and found a quiet corner where I could speak privately. What did you find? The apartment wasn't purchased by your parents, Sarah explained. It was inherited property that came to you through your paternal grandmother, Catherine Chen, who passed away 18 months ago. According to the will and trust documents, she left you several properties and a substantial financial legacy. Catherine Chen, my father's mother, who had died suddenly of a heart attack while I was finishing my final semester of nursing school. I had been devastated by her death, but had been told by my parents that her modest estate had been distributed among various charities, with small memorial gifts going to family members. That can't be right, I said. My grandmother lived in a small apartment and worked as a seamstress her whole life. She didn't have enough money to own downtown real estate. According to the probate records, Catherine Chen owned 4 apartment buildings in the city, a portfolio of investment stocks worth approximately $1.2 million, and several other properties including the apartment your parents gave to your brother, Sarah continued. She left everything to you with a specific provision that your parents were to serve as trustees until your 21st birthday. The break room seemed to spin around me as I processed this information. My grandmother, who had always lived simply, and whom my parents had described as financially struggling, had been a wealthy property investor who had left me everything she owned. Why didn't my parents tell me about the inheritance? That's where the situation becomes legally problematic, Sarah said grimly. According to the trust documents, your parents were required to inform you of the inheritance on your 18th birthday and provide you with annual reports about the management of your assets. They were also required to transfer full legal control to you on your 21st birthday. My 21st birthday. 3 days ago, when they had handed me a $10 gift card while giving Marcus an apartment that had legally belonged to me for 18 months. Are you saying my parents have been stealing from me? I'm saying they've been managing assets that belong to you without your knowledge or consent, and they've been using those assets for purposes that don't appear to benefit you directly. That apartment they gave to Marcus, it was purchased with funds from your inheritance. The betrayal was so profound that I couldn't initially process the emotions it triggered. Not only had my parents spent 21 years treating me as the less valuable child, but they had been using my own money to fund Marcus's privileged lifestyle while telling me I needed to be more independent and practical. How much money are we talking about? I asked. The current value of your inheritance, including property appreciation and investment growth, is approximately $2.8 million. I dropped my coffee cup, watching it shatter against the break room floor, while trying to comprehend that I was not only wealthy, but had been wealthy for my entire adult life without knowing it. Every struggle to pay for college, every extra shift I had worked to afford basic necessities, every time I had been told we couldn't afford something I needed, all of it had been unnecessary because I had access to resources that could have solved every financial problem I had ever faced. Elena, are you there? I'm here, I said, staring at the spilled coffee and thinking about every sacrifice I had made because my parents had convinced me we were a middle-class family with limited resources. There's more. Your grandmother left a letter specifically for you, to be delivered when you gained control of your inheritance. It's sealed and can only be opened by you, but it might explain why she structured her will the way she did. After my shift ended, I drove directly to Sarah's office to review the inheritance documents and receive my grandmother's letter. The legal paperwork was overwhelming. Property deeds, stock portfolios, trust agreements, and financial reports that painted a picture of a woman who had been far more sophisticated and wealthy than anyone in our family had ever acknowledged. But it was the letter that broke my heart and explained everything I had never understood about my family dynamics. My dearest Elena, the letter began in my grandmother's careful handwriting. If you are reading this, it means you have reached your 21st birthday and discovered the inheritance I left specifically for you. I hope it comes as a pleasant surprise, but I suspect it may also come as a shock if your parents have continued the pattern of treating you as less important than your brother. My grandmother had been watching. She had seen the favoritism, the neglect, the systematic way my parents had diminished my worth while elevating Marcus. I worked for 60 years to build this wealth, starting with nothing when I immigrated to this country as a young woman. I bought my first apartment building when your father was a child, using money I saved by working multiple jobs and living frugally. Over the decades, I invested carefully and built a portfolio that would ensure my family's financial security. She explained how she had watched Robert and Margaret raise their children with such obvious favoritism that she had become concerned about my future welfare. Your parents love Marcus in a way that blinds them to his limitations, she wrote. They give him everything while expecting you to earn everything, not understanding that this pattern is harmful to both children. Marcus will never develop strength or independence if he never faces consequences, and you have been denied opportunities and recognition that could help you flourish. The letter went on to describe specific incidents she had witnessed, times when my achievements were ignored, when my needs were dismissed, when I was expected to be grateful for scraps while Marcus was celebrated for mediocrity. I am leaving you everything because you are the child who will use it wisely, who will appreciate its value, and who will ensure it benefits future generations, rather than being wasted on immediate gratification. But more than that, I am leaving it to you, because you deserve to understand that you have always been precious and worthy of investment, even when the people raising you failed to recognize that truth. As I finished reading my grandmother's words, I realized that the $10 gift card hadn't just been an insult. It had been the final catalyst that had forced my parents to reveal their deception. They had been managing my wealth while treating me like a burden, and now they were panicking because their trusteeship had legally ended, and I was entitled to everything they had been hiding from me. The overlooked daughter was about to become the family's primary financial power, and that shift was going to change everything about our relationships. The safe deposit box at First National Bank contained more than legal documents. It held the pieces of my grandmother's life story that my family had never bothered to share with me. Sarah had arranged for me to access the box using my inheritance paperwork, and what I found inside painted a picture of Catherine Chen that was radically different from the modest, struggling widow my parents had always described. Photographs spanning 6 decades showed my grandmother's transformation from a young immigrant woman with determined eyes to a successful businesswoman who had built an empire one careful investment at a time. There she was at the grand opening of her first restaurant in 1962, standing proudly beside the Chen's Family Kitchen sign. Here she was, cutting the ribbon at the opening of her second apartment building in 1978, surrounded by city officials and business partners who clearly respected her acumen. But the most revealing documents were her personal journals, written in a mixture of English and Chinese characters that told the story of a woman who had overcome tremendous obstacles to create generational wealth for her family. "Robert thinks I am just lucky with money," she had written in an entry from 1995. "He does not understand that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. I work 16-hour days. I study every investment. I sacrifice luxuries so my family can have security. But he sees only an old woman who somehow has money to help when he needs it." The journal entries spanning the last 5 years of her life revealed her growing concern about the way Robert and Margaret were raising their children, and her specific fears about what would happen to me as I reached adulthood. "Elena is brilliant and hardworking, but she has been convinced that she deserves nothing," Catherine had written after attending my high school graduation. "She apologized to me for accepting the $500 I gave her for college expenses, saying she knew money was tight and she didn't want to be a burden. Meanwhile, Marcus expects everything and appreciates nothing. How can parents be so blind to their children's true nature?" Another entry, dated just 6 months before her death, described a conversation she had overheard between my parents about my future. Margaret told Robert that Elena would be fine because she was the type of person who thrives on challenges, while Marcus needed more support because he was sensitive and artistic. I wanted to scream at them that Elena thrives despite their neglect, not because of it, and that Marcus is weak precisely because they have never allowed him to face real challenges. But the most heartbreaking entries were her descriptions of specific moments when she had watched my parents dismiss my achievements while celebrating Marcus's mediocrity. Elena won the state science fair, but Robert and Margaret spent dinner talking about Marcus's C+ in remedial math as if it were a doctoral degree. Elena sat quietly, used to being invisible, while they praised Marcus for improvement that still left him failing. I see her learning to expect nothing, and it breaks my heart. The final journal entry, written just 2 weeks before her death, explained her decision to leave everything to me despite knowing it would create family conflict. "I have decided to leave Elena everything, not as punishment for Robert and Margaret's favoritism, but as correction for it. Elena has been preparing her whole life to handle responsibility and challenge. Marcus has been prepared for nothing except receiving gifts he did not earn. My legacy should go to the grandchild who will honor it by using it wisely." But Catherine had been strategic about more than just money. She had also been documenting evidence of financial mismanagement and potential fraud that she suspected might occur after her death. Hidden in the safe deposit box were copies of every financial transaction related to my trust fund over the past 18 months, including withdrawals my parents had made for purposes that had nothing to do with my welfare or education. They had used my inheritance money to pay off Marcus's credit card debt, to cover their own mortgage payments when Robert's business struggled, and to finance lifestyle expenses that they could never have afforded on their actual income. "They are stealing from Elena while telling her she needs to be more financially responsible," Catherine had noted in a document titled "Evidence of Trust Violations." "They use her money to solve their problems while making her believe she is the problem." The most damning evidence was a recording Catherine had made of a conversation between Robert and Margaret just months before her death, in which they discussed their plans for managing my inheritance. "Elena doesn't need to know about the money until she's older and more mature." Margaret's voice was clear on the recording. "We can use the funds to help Marcus get established, and by the time Elena is ready for independence, there will still be plenty left for her needs. Besides," Robert had added, "Elena is the type of person who will be successful regardless of financial support. Marcus needs more help to reach his potential. They had been using my money to fund Marcus's potential, while I worked multiple jobs to pay for necessities and education. They had literally been stealing from me while praising me for my independence and self-sufficiency. But Catherine had prepared for this possibility. Along with the documentation of their mismanagement, she had included detailed instructions for recovering misappropriated funds and pursuing legal action for breach of fiduciary duty. "Elena," her final letter continued, "I have given you not just money, but the tools to hold your parents accountable for their betrayal of your trust. You have the choice to forgive them and allow them to continue managing your resources, or you can demand full restitution and complete independence. Choose the path that serves your long-term welfare, not their short-term comfort." As I left the bank with copies of all the documentation, I realized that my grandmother had given me something far more valuable than financial security. She had given me validation that my perceptions of family favoritism had been accurate, evidence that I had been systematically undervalued, and the legal tools to demand justice for years of exploitation and neglect. But most importantly, she had given me a model of what it looked like for an older woman to recognize a younger woman's worth and fight to ensure she received opportunities equal to her capabilities. My phone was ringing constantly now. Robert, Margaret, and Marcus all demanding that I stop this nonsense and return home to work out a reasonable solution. They still believed I was the compliant, practical daughter who would ultimately choose family harmony over personal justice. They had no idea that I now possessed comprehensive documentation of their financial crimes, legal representation, and the financial resources to fight them for as long as necessary. The overlooked daughter was about to show them exactly how much their practical, independent child had learned from 21 years of their harsh but inadvertent lessons in survival and strategic thinking. The siege began at 5:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning, with Robert calling my cell phone repeatedly until I finally answered just to stop the relentless ringing that was disturbing other guests at the motel. "Elena, this has gone far enough." His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "You're tearing this family apart over a misunderstanding that can be resolved in 5 minutes if you would just listen to reason." "I'm listening," I said, settling back against the pillows and preparing for what I suspected would be an illuminating conversation. "What exactly do you want to discuss?" "I want you to come home so we can sit down like adults and work out a fair solution to this legal confusion. Your grandmother obviously intended for her assets to benefit the entire family, not just one person. The entire family." After 21 years of being told that resources were limited and needed to be allocated based on practical considerations, my father was suddenly interested in sharing my grandmother's wealth equally among all family members. "Dad, I've been reading Grandmother Catherine's will and trust documents. She was very specific about her intentions. She left everything to me because she wanted me to have it. Elena, you don't understand the complexities of family financial planning. Your grandmother was elderly and may not have fully understood the implications of her decisions. The responsible thing to do is to distribute her assets in a way that benefits everyone fairly." Fairly. The word felt surreal, coming from a man who had spent decades distributing family resources in ways that systematically disadvantaged me while advantaging my brother. "How much of my inheritance money have you and Mom spent on Marcus over the past 18 months? The silence on the other end of the call was answer enough, but Robert eventually cleared his throat and attempted to justify what was clearly financial fraud. "We used some of the trust funds to help Marcus with educational and living expenses. That's exactly the kind of family support your grandmother would have wanted. She loved both of you equally." "Actually, Dad, I have documentation showing that Grandmother Catherine was very concerned about the way you and Mom treated Marcus and me differently. She left detailed journals describing her observations of family favoritism and her specific reasons for leaving everything to me, rather than distributing it among family members." Another long silence, followed by what sounded like muffled conversation, as Robert apparently consulted with Margaret about how to respond to this unexpected revelation. "Elena," he said finally, "your grandmother may have been confused or influenced by misperceptions about our family dynamics. The important thing now is to move forward in a way that preserves family relationships and honors her true intentions." Her true intentions were documented in legal documents prepared by competent attorneys. She wanted me to have control of her assets when I turned 21. Yesterday was my 21st birthday, which means I now have full legal authority over everything she left me. "This is ridiculous." Marcus's voice came on the line as he apparently grabbed the phone from our father. "Elena, you're being selfish and vindictive because you didn't get the birthday presents you wanted. That apartment was given to me, and everyone knows it. Stop trying to steal my gift because you're jealous." The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. Marcus genuinely believed that the apartment was his gift, that I was trying to steal something that belonged to him, and that my objection to financial fraud was motivated by jealousy rather than justice. "Marcus," I said calmly, "the apartment was purchased with money from my inheritance. According to the legal documents, you've been living in property that belongs to me, furnished with my money, while I worked multiple jobs to pay for basic necessities." "That's insane," Marcus snapped. "Mom and Dad bought that apartment for my graduation. It has nothing to do with you or some imaginary inheritance." Imaginary inheritance. My brother was so accustomed to receiving everything, while I received nothing, that he couldn't process the reality that financial resources might flow in the opposite direction. "Marcus, I'm looking at bank statements showing that the down payment for your apartment came directly from my trust fund. The furniture, the security deposit, the first 6 months of utilities. All of it was paid for with money that Grandmother Catherine left specifically for me. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "There's no way Mom and Dad would use your money to buy me an apartment. That doesn't even make sense." "It makes perfect sense if you understand that they've been managing my inheritance without telling me about it, using my money to solve family financial problems while teaching me to be grateful for $10 gift cards." The phone went silent again, and I could hear heated discussion in the background before Margaret's voice came on the line. "Elena, sweetheart, I think you're misunderstanding some very complex financial arrangements. Your father and I have been managing various family investments and assets in ways that benefit everyone. The apartment situation is more complicated than it appears on paper. More complicated. The standard family explanation for any situation that might reveal their systematic favoritism or financial mismanagement. Mom, it's actually very simple. Grandmother Catherine left me approximately $2.8 million in assets, including the apartment you gave to Marcus. You and Dad were supposed to tell me about this inheritance when I turned 18 and transfer legal control to me when I turned 21. Instead, you've been spending my money while telling me I need to be more financially independent. Elena, Margaret's voice rose to a pitch that suggested genuine panic. Where are you getting these figures? Who have you been talking to about family financial matters? Family financial matters. As if my own inheritance was somehow confidential information that I shouldn't be allowed to access or understand. I've been talking to the lawyer who's helping me understand my legal rights and recover the assets that belong to me. I've also been reading Grandmother's journals, where she documented your financial mismanagement and her concerns about the way you've treated me throughout my childhood. The call ended abruptly, followed by a series of text messages that escalated from pleading to threatening. "Margaret, Elena, please come home so we can work this out as a family. You're going to destroy relationships over money that was meant to help everyone. Robert, you're being manipulated by lawyers who want to profit from family conflict. Think about the damage you're doing to people who love you. Marcus, if you don't give me back my apartment, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what a selfish bitch you really are." I screenshot the threatening text from Marcus and forwarded it to Sarah Martinez, along with a summary of the morning's phone conversations. Her response was immediate and professionally outraged. "Elena, these communications show consciousness of guilt and potential witness intimidation. Your family is not reacting like people who believe they have legal rights to the property they're demanding. They're reacting like people who know they've been caught doing something wrong." The desperate calls and threats were confirmation that my parents understood exactly what they had done and exactly how much legal trouble they were facing. The question now was whether they would continue trying to manipulate me into giving up my inheritance, or whether they would acknowledge their fraud and attempt to make restitution. Either way, the overlooked daughter was no longer overlooked, and the family's financial crimes were about to face legal consequences. The law offices of Harrison and Associates buzzed with expensive energy, marble floors, mahogany paneling, and attorneys whose hourly rates exceeded most people's monthly salaries. I had been summoned to this meeting through Sarah Martinez, who informed me that my parents had retained aggressive representation and were prepared to challenge my inheritance claim through all available legal means. "They're not messing around," Sarah warned me, as we walked through the downtown legal district toward what she called the Shark's Den. Harrison and Associates specializes in wealth disputes and estate challenges. They charge $800 per hour, and they don't take cases they don't expect to win. I was wearing my best professional outfit, a navy blue dress I had bought for job interviews, paired with conservative heels that clicked against the marble with more confidence than I actually felt. But inside my briefcase were documents that I hoped would prove more powerful than expensive legal representation. Bank records, trust agreements, and my grandmother's detailed journals documenting years of family financial fraud. The conference room could have accommodated 20 people, but only 6 of us sat around the polished table that probably cost more than my annual salary. My parents looked uncomfortable despite being on their own legal turf, while Marcus slouched in his chair with the petulant expression of someone forced to attend a meeting about problems he didn't think he should have to solve. Across from us sat Thomas Harrison, the senior partner whose firm name was on the building directory, and Jennifer Walsh, an associate who specialized in estate litigation. Both looked like they had stepped out of a legal drama, impeccably groomed, professionally intimidating, and clearly accustomed to winning disputes through superior resources and aggressive tactics. "Ms. Chen," Thomas Harrison began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "We're here because your parents are concerned about what they perceive as your misunderstanding of your grandmother's estate intentions and your recent decisions to engage legal representation without consulting family members who have been managing these assets responsibly for 18 months. misunderstanding, responsible management. The same dismissive language my parents had been using throughout my childhood, now delivered by attorneys who were being paid to make their version of reality sound legally compelling. I don't believe there's any misunderstanding, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I understand that my grandmother left me her entire estate and that my parents were supposed to transfer legal control to me on my 21st birthday. I also understand that they've been spending my inheritance money without my knowledge or consent. Jennifer Walsh opened a thick folder and began spreading documents across the table. Ms. Chen, estate management is complex, and trustees have broad discretionary authority to make decisions they believe serve the beneficiary's best interests. Your parents have detailed records showing that all trust expenditures were made for purposes that ultimately benefit you or your family. She showed me financial statements that had been prepared specifically for this meeting, carefully formatted documents that presented every expenditure in language that made theft sound like prudent family financial planning. The apartment that was provided to your brother represents an investment in family stability that preserves assets for your long-term benefit, Jennifer continued. Rather than allowing trust funds to sit idle, your parents made strategic decisions to support family members whose success contributes to overall family welfare. Family welfare. They were arguing that using my money to buy Marcus an apartment had somehow benefited me because his success would theoretically contribute to family prosperity that I would eventually share. That's interesting, I said, pulling out my own documents. But according to my grandmother's journals, she specifically worried that my parents were using my potential inheritance to enable Marcus's irresponsibility while neglecting my actual needs and development. I read directly from Catherine's journal entries, watching my parents' faces grow pale as I quoted her observations about their systematic favoritism and her concerns about their fitness to manage my financial interests. Elena has been working multiple jobs to pay for college expenses while Robert and Margaret discuss using her trust funds to pay Marcus's credit card debt, I read aloud. They seem to believe that Elena's strength means she deserves less support, while Marcus's weakness means he deserves more resources. This is exactly backwards from what will actually help both children develop into successful adults. Thomas Harrison's professional composure flickered slightly as he realized that my grandmother had been documenting evidence of financial mismanagement in real time, creating a contemporaneous record that would be difficult to challenge in court. Ms. Chen, he said, private journal entries reflect one person's subjective impressions and cannot override legal trust documents that give trustees broad discretionary authority. You're right, I agreed. But bank records aren't subjective impressions, and I have 18 months of financial statements showing that my parents used trust funds for purposes that had nothing to do with my welfare or benefit. Sarah Martinez had prepared a comprehensive presentation showing exactly how my inheritance money had been spent. $85,000 for Marcus's apartment down payment and furnishing, $23,000 to pay off his credit card debts, $12,000 for his car repairs and insurance, and $31,000 for various family expenses, including home improvements and vacation trips that I had not been included in. Over $150,000 of Ms. Chen's inheritance has been used for expenditures that provided no benefit to her whatsoever, Sarah said, her voice sharp with professional indignation. Meanwhile, she was working multiple jobs to pay for college expenses and basic necessities because her parents told her they couldn't afford to help with her education or living costs. Jennifer Walsh attempted to argue that family expenditures ultimately benefited all family members, but her arguments grew increasingly weak as Sarah presented evidence of my parents' deception about their financial situation and their systematic exclusion of me from benefits that were purchased with my own money. The defendants used trust funds to finance a lifestyle they could not otherwise afford, while telling the beneficiary that she needed to be more financially independent, Sarah concluded. This represents a clear breach of fiduciary duty and potential criminal fraud. The meeting concluded with threats and counter-threats about potential litigation, but I could see that my parents' legal team was less confident than they had been at the beginning of the session. The evidence of their financial mismanagement was overwhelming, and my grandmother's documentation provided a clear record of intent that would be difficult to challenge. As we left the law firm, Robert made one final attempt at emotional manipulation. Elena, please don't let lawyers destroy our family over money. We can work this out ourselves if you'll just trust us to do what's best for everyone. Trust them. After 21 years of systematic favoritism and 18 months of financial fraud, he was asking me to trust them to continue managing my resources in ways that served their interests rather than mine. Dad, I said quietly, I trusted you my entire childhood. And you used that trust to convince me I wasn't worth investing in while you spent my inheritance on the child you actually valued. I'm not making that mistake again. The legal warfare was just beginning, but I now understood that I had advantages my parents had never expected. comprehensive documentation, competent legal representation, and the financial resources to fight them for as long as necessary. The overlooked daughter was about to show them exactly how much she had learned from their harsh lessons in strategic thinking and resource management. The private investigator my attorney recommended looked nothing like the hard-boiled detective I had imagined. Linda Rodriguez was a former forensic accountant in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of methodical approach to evidence that had made her successful in uncovering financial crimes for corporate clients and divorce attorneys. Family financial fraud cases are often the most emotionally challenging, Linda explained as we met in her modest office near the courthouse, but they're also the most thoroughly documented. Family members get comfortable with their deceptions and stop being careful about covering their tracks. She had spent 2 weeks investigating my parents' financial history, following paper trails, and conducting interviews with people who had known my grandmother personally. What she discovered painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond the inheritance fraud I had already uncovered. "Your parents have been lying about their financial situation for years," Linda reported, spreading bank statements and tax documents across her desk. "They've been using your inheritance money not just for Marcus's apartment, but to maintain a lifestyle that's completely unsustainable based on their actual income." The evidence was staggering. Robert's construction business had been losing money for 3 years, sustained only by regular cash infusions from my trust fund that had been disguised as loans that were never repaid. Margaret's part-time job at a boutique clothing store generated minimal income, but their credit card statements showed luxury purchases that would have been impossible on their combined legitimate earnings. "They've been essentially broke for years while presenting themselves as successful middle-class professionals," Linda continued. "The house payments, the car payments, Marcus's college expenses, their vacation trips, their country club membership, all of it has been funded by your inheritance while they told you the family couldn't afford to help with your education or living expenses." But the most devastating revelation came from Linda's interviews with my grandmother's friends and business associates, people who had known Catherine Chen personally and understood her concerns about my parents' treatment of their children. "Your grandmother had been documenting your parents' behavior for years," Linda explained, pulling out photocopied pages from additional journals that Catherine had kept at her apartment. She wasn't just concerned about financial management. She was genuinely worried about emotional abuse and the psychological damage being done to both children. The journal entries Linda had discovered were even more explicit than the ones I had found in the safe deposit box. Catherine had been conducting what amounted to a psychological study of our family dynamics, documenting specific incidents and analyzing the long-term impact of my parents' parenting choices. "Elena asks for nothing and receives nothing, while Marcus demands everything and receives everything," Catherine had written after attending my high school graduation. "This pattern is destroying Elena's sense of self-worth while preventing Marcus from developing any real character or capabilities. Robert and Margaret seem to believe they are being kind to Marcus, but they are actually handicapping him while simultaneously crushing Elena's spirit." Another entry, dated just months before her death, described a conversation with my mother that had convinced Catherine that legal intervention would be necessary to protect me from continued exploitation. "Margaret told me today that Elena was naturally independent and didn't need family support the way Marcus did. When I suggested that Elena might benefit from having some of her college expenses covered, Margaret laughed and said Elena was too proud to accept help anyway. The cruelty was breathtaking. They have convinced themselves that their neglect is actually kindness, and that Elena's pain is somehow evidence of her strength. But the most shocking discovery came from Linda's investigation into Marcus's actual behavior and activities over the past 2 years. While my parents had been telling family members that Marcus was focusing on his education and developing his business ideas, he had actually been engaging in behavior that could expose the family to significant legal and financial liability. "Your brother has been using the apartment your parents bought him as a location for what appears to be an illegal gambling operation," Linda reported, showing me photographs and financial records she had obtained through her investigation. "He's been hosting high-stakes poker games for wealthy college students, taking a percentage of each game and potentially violating multiple state and federal laws. The evidence included bank deposits that clearly showed Marcus receiving large cash payments on a regular basis, despite having no legitimate source of income. There were also credit card statements showing purchases of expensive gaming equipment and surveillance technology that suggested a sophisticated illegal operation. The apartment your parents bought him with your inheritance money has been converted into what amounts to an underground casino," Linda continued. "If law enforcement becomes aware of this activity, the property could be subject to forfeiture as proceeds from illegal gambling operations. The property that legally belonged to me was being used by my brother for criminal activities that could result in its seizure by federal authorities. The apartment my parents had given him as a graduation gift had become the base of operations for illegal activity that put my inheritance at risk. But Linda's investigation had also uncovered evidence that my parents knew about Marcus's illegal activities and had been actively enabling them. Your mother has been making regular visits to the apartment to help Marcus manage the gambling operation, Linda reported, showing me surveillance photographs of Margaret entering and leaving the building at times that corresponded with Marcus's gaming events. She appears to be helping with bookkeeping and money management for what is essentially organized illegal gambling. The scope of my family's deception was beyond anything I had imagined. Not only had they stolen my inheritance and lied about their financial situation, but they had been using my money to fund illegal activities while knowingly exposing my assets to criminal forfeiture. The good news, Linda concluded, is that you have overwhelming evidence for both civil and criminal charges against your parents. The bad news is that your inheritance may be significantly reduced by the time you recover it, depending on how much they've spent and whether any assets are subject to criminal forfeiture. As I drove back to my motel that evening, I realized that my parents' betrayal was far more comprehensive than I had initially understood. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had been actively damaging my financial interests while using my resources to enable criminal behavior that could destroy what remained of my inheritance. The $10 gift card that had seemed like the ultimate insult now appeared to be the least of their offenses. They had been systematically looting my inheritance for years, while teaching me to be grateful for scraps, and they had put my financial future at risk by using my property for illegal activities. But they had also underestimated me completely. The overlooked daughter they had dismissed as naturally independent had developed exactly the skills necessary to uncover their crimes and hold them accountable for every dollar they had stolen. The family that had taught me to expect nothing was about to learn what it felt like to lose everything. The emergency family meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at my parents' house, the same dining room where they had presented Marcus with apartment keys while handing me a gift card just 2 weeks earlier. But this time, I arrived with Sarah Martinez, a briefcase full of evidence, and the legal authority to demand accountability for years of financial fraud and emotional manipulation. My parents had decorated the dining room as if we were gathering for a celebration rather than a reckoning. Fresh flowers on the table, my mother's best china set for 5 people, and an elaborate brunch spread that had probably cost more money stolen from my inheritance. The performance of family normalcy was surreal, given that we were meeting to discuss criminal fraud and the systematic theft of my assets. Marcus was already seated at the table when we arrived, wearing the sullen expression of someone who had been forced to attend a meeting about problems he didn't believe were his responsibility. He barely looked up when I entered with my attorney, as if my legal representation was just another example of my tendency toward unnecessary drama. "Elena, sweetheart," Margaret said with forced brightness, "I'm so glad you decided to work this out as a family, instead of involving outsiders in our private business. Private business, the theft of nearly $200,000 from my inheritance, had been relegated to a family disagreement that could be resolved through conversation and compromise. Actually, Mom, Sarah is here because this meeting is being recorded, and because I want legal documentation of everything that's discussed today." The change in atmosphere was immediate. Robert's welcoming smile disappeared, and Margaret's hands began shaking as she realized this wasn't going to be the emotional manipulation session they had planned. "Elena," Robert said carefully, "surely we don't need lawyers and recording devices to have an honest conversation about family financial arrangements." "We do when those family financial arrangements constitute felony theft and breach of fiduciary duty," Sarah replied, setting her briefcase on the table and pulling out thick folders of documentation. "And when family members have made threats against my client and continue to engage in illegal activities that put her assets at risk." I placed copies of Linda Rodriguez's investigation report in front of each family member, watching their faces as they realized the scope of what I had discovered about their financial crimes and Marcus's illegal gambling operation. "This report documents every dollar you've stolen from my inheritance over the past 18 months, I said calmly. "It also documents Marcus's use of my apartment for illegal gambling activities and Mom's participation in those criminal enterprises." Marcus looked up from the report with genuine shock. "How did you get photographs of me inside my apartment? Have you been having me followed?" "It's not your apartment, Marcus," I replied. "It's my apartment, purchased with my money and legally titled in my name. You've been living in my property while using it for criminal activities that could result in federal forfeiture." Margaret was crying now, the careful composure she had maintained throughout my childhood, finally cracking under the weight of documented evidence. "Elena, please don't destroy your family over money," she pleaded. "We made some mistakes in managing your trust fund. but everything we did was motivated by love and concern for your welfare. Love? The word came out harsher than I had intended, but 21 years of suppressed pain was rising to the surface. You spent my inheritance on vacations I wasn't invited to, a house I was kicked out of, and an apartment for the son you actually love while I worked multiple jobs to pay for necessities. You used my money to fund illegal gambling operations while lecturing me about being more financially responsible. Robert attempted to regain control of the conversation. Elena, you're young, and you don't understand the complexities of family financial management. Your grandmother left that money in trust because she understood that young people sometimes make poor decisions with large amounts of money. Grandmother left detailed journals explaining exactly why she left the money to me instead of distributing it among family members, I replied, pulling out copies of Catherine's writings. She documented years of your favoritism, your financial irresponsibility, and her specific concerns about your fitness as trustees. I read aloud from Catherine's most damning entries, watching my parents' faces as they heard their dead mother-in-law's assessment of their parenting and their character. Elena has been systematically devalued and exploited by parents who mistake her strength for evidence that she needs less love and support, I quoted. Meanwhile, Marcus has been enabled and indulged in ways that have prevented him from developing any real capabilities or character. I am leaving Elena everything because she is the only family member who will use it wisely and ethically. The silence that followed was broken by Marcus's angry outburst. This is all bullshit, he snapped, throwing the investigation report across the table. Grandmother was old and confused when she wrote that will. She didn't understand family dynamics, and she was probably being manipulated by lawyers who wanted to create drama. Marcus, I said quietly, grandmother understood family dynamics perfectly. She watched you receive everything while I received nothing, and she made legal arrangements to correct that imbalance. The only person who's confused is you, because you've spent your entire life believing you deserved everything without earning anything. Sarah Martinez took control of the conversation, her professional voice cutting through the emotional chaos. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, you have 72 hours to begin restitution for the misappropriated trust funds, or we will file criminal charges for theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Marcus, you have 24 hours to vacate the apartment and cease all illegal activities on Elena's property, or we will report the gambling operation to federal authorities. The ultimatum was delivered with the calm authority of someone who had extensive experience with family financial crimes and their consequences. We'll also need a complete accounting of all trust fund expenditures, documentation of any remaining assets, and signed agreements acknowledging Elena's full legal ownership of all inherited property. Robert looked like a man who had just watched his entire carefully constructed world collapse. Elena, he said desperately, please don't send your parents to prison over money. We can work out a payment plan. We can make this right without destroying the family. You destroyed the family 21 years ago when you decided I was worth less than Marcus, I replied. I'm just documenting the evidence. As I packed up my documents and prepared to leave, Margaret made one final attempt at emotional manipulation. Elena, your grandmother would be heartbroken to see you using her money to hurt the family she loved. I stopped at the dining room doorway and looked back at the people who had spent my entire childhood teaching me that love was something I would have to earn, but could never quite deserve. Grandmother would be proud of me for having the courage to demand justice for years of exploitation and abuse, I said. And she would be heartbroken to see that even when faced with overwhelming evidence of your crimes, you're still trying to make this my fault. The overlooked daughter was no longer overlooked, and the family that had taught her to expect nothing was about to learn the true cost of their systematic cruelty and theft. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my downtown apartment, the same apartment my parents had given to Marcus as a birthday gift, not knowing it legally belonged to me, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of gold and possibility. The view that had once represented everything I thought I could never have was now the backdrop for a life I was building on my own terms, funded by an inheritance that had finally been restored to its rightful owner. The legal proceedings had unfolded exactly as Sarah Martinez had predicted. Faced with overwhelming evidence of financial fraud and the threat of criminal prosecution, my parents had agreed to a settlement that required full restitution of misappropriated trust funds, plus interest and penalties that brought the total to nearly $300,000. Robert had been forced to sell his construction business, and Margaret had liquidated her retirement accounts, but they had avoided prison sentences by agreeing to plead guilty to civil fraud and accepting 5 years of financial probation. Marcus had been more defiant, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing until federal agents raided the apartment and seized evidence of his illegal gambling operation. Faced with potential money laundering and racketeering charges, he had eventually agreed to plead guilty to operating an illegal gambling enterprise in exchange for a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised probation. But the most satisfying resolution had come from an unexpected source. Other family members who had been deceived by my parents' lies about their financial situation and my character. Once the truth about the inheritance and the systematic favoritism came to light, relatives who had always treated me as the problem child began reaching out with apologies and support. My cousin Jennifer, who had always been held up as another example of what I should aspire to become, called to apologize for years of family gatherings where she had unknowingly participated in my marginalization. "I had no idea how badly your parents were treating you," she said during one of our long phone conversations. "They always made it sound like you were the difficult one, the one who created drama and demanded too much attention. I feel terrible for believing their version of events." Even my Aunt Susan, who had rarely paid attention to me during childhood, reached out to acknowledge what she had witnessed, but failed to address. "I should have spoken up," she admitted during a lunch meeting where she struggled to make eye contact. "I could see that you were being treated differently than Marcus, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere with their parenting decisions. I'm sorry for not protecting you when you needed an adult ally." The acknowledgement was validating, but more important was the understanding that I no longer needed their protection or approval. The inheritance my grandmother had left me had provided more than financial security. It had given me the resources and independence to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional desperation. I had used part of the recovered funds to complete my nursing education without debt and to establish a small foundation that provided scholarships for young people from dysfunctional families who were working to pay their own education expenses. The Elena Catherine Chen Foundation would ensure that other overlooked children had opportunities to develop their potential without depending on family members who might not value their worth. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in my relationship with my grandmother's memory. Through her journals and the investigation into her business affairs, I had discovered a woman of remarkable strength and wisdom who had built substantial wealth through decades of careful work and strategic thinking. Catherine Chen had immigrated to the United States with nothing, worked multiple jobs while raising a family, and eventually built a real estate empire that provided security for future generations. But more than her financial success, she had demonstrated the importance of recognizing and nurturing potential in people others might overlook. The safe deposit box had contained one final letter, sealed and marked, to be opened on Elena's 22nd birthday or after family legal matters are resolved, whichever comes first. "My dearest Elena," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have successfully claimed your inheritance and held your parents accountable for their betrayal of your trust. I am proud of you for having the courage to fight for what belonged to you, even when that fight required challenging people who should have been protecting your interests." Catherine had anticipated that my parents would attempt to challenge my inheritance and had prepared additional evidence and resources to support my legal claim. "I chose to leave everything to you not because I loved you more than other family members, but because I recognized qualities in you that others failed to see: integrity, resilience, and the wisdom to use resources for purposes that extend beyond immediate gratification." The letter continued with specific suggestions for how I might use the inheritance to build a meaningful life, while also contributing to the welfare of others who face similar challenges. "Wealth is a tool, not a destination," Catherine had written. "Use it to create opportunities for yourself and others, but never allow it to become a substitute for the personal growth and relationships that give life meaning." As I finished reading my grandmother's final advice, I realized that the overlooked daughter had not only been seen and valued by the person whose opinion mattered most, but had been carefully prepared to handle both the inheritance and the family conflicts that would inevitably arise from challenging years of established dysfunction. My parents had not contacted me since the legal settlement, choosing to maintain their narrative that I was the vindictive daughter who had destroyed family harmony over money. Marcus had sent a few bitter text messages accusing me of ruining his life, but had otherwise disappeared into whatever consequences awaited adults who had never learned to face real challenges independently. I felt sad about the family relationships that had been damaged, but I also understood that those relationships had been built on false foundations that needed to be dismantled before anything genuine could be constructed in their place. The nursing position at the medical center had evolved into a leadership role in patient advocacy, work that allowed me to use both my professional skills and my personal experience with systemic unfairness to help people navigate complex institutional challenges. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself independently of other people's recognition or approval, understanding finally that the overlooked daughter had never actually been invisible. She had simply been surrounded by people who chose not to see her clearly. Standing on the balcony of my legally owned apartment, watching the city wake up below me, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from discovering you are exactly as strong and capable as you always suspected you might be, once the people limiting your potential were no longer controlling your opportunities. The $10 gift card that had seemed like the ultimate insult had actually been the catalyst that revealed my true worth, not as the overlooked daughter of people who couldn't love me appropriately, but as the rightful heir to a woman who had recognized my value and ensured I would have the resources to build the life I deserved.